In this video, I want to be speaking to you about the message of the Hebrew Bible from a Jamaican liberation perspective. And to begin that, I have not really read anything about what I'm going to say to you today. Well, not directly. Maybe I've gotten ideas from place to place, but largely this is my own thinking. I say this not as a boast, but more as a warning that here are my thoughts, perhaps unsubstantiated by many scholars. Nevertheless, I commend them to you. But first, I need to make some declarations or some explanations. Why call it a Jamaican perspective? I think my experience as a Jamaican has forced me to think of the Bible in response to particular realities that we face here in Jamaica every day. Unlike many, I believe that the Bible speaks to many specific situations that we face. Our realities are remarkably like those of the biblical characters. And in many ways, what the Bible says to them is exactly what it says to us in our everyday circumstances. But why liberation? Because by liberation, I believe that the Bible's message helps to deliver us from the evil systems and thought patterns that bound us to destructive elements of life. These systems and patterns are bigger than our traditional narrow concerns of personal sin. And when addressed, they will of necessity work for the transformation of our society and the liberation of mankind. They don't replace our spiritual needs, but when we address them, we find that along with our spiritual needs, many of our daily realities are also dealt with. So let's begin with an overview. The Bible has a consistent theme of God caring for people who are at the very bottom of society. The mighty and powerful are more often than not the recipients of the wrath of God, while the underdog finds his favor. Of course, this does not mean that simply because you're an underdog, God will overlook your wickedness. But it means that sometimes, and many times, God overlooks what we deem to be wicked among the underdog because she or he has been forced into such behavior by the mighty and powerful. The Old Testament is replete with these stories, and while they do not contradict the positions made in the earlier lectures, they do paint a picture of God and mankind that we would do well to remember. So, how will we proceed in this examination to try to demonstrate my point? Well, we will be examining various passages throughout the Old Testament to make our point. Given the nature of this presentation, we cannot go in depth in all these passages, but at least we will try to mention the salient points. We want also to examine a perspective as to what motivates God to have this preferential option for the outcast. I want to make a disclaimer. No doubt my ideas are influenced by liberation theology as a discipline in itself, and various other liberation theologies. We can have a discussion about these also impact on what I'm saying. But I have not read enough of these to say that I'm borrowing significantly from them. In the beginning, the scriptures present us with the idea that God created all things, that man was to be the pinnacle of his creation, and he gave man the mandate to govern the earth well. We learn that in Genesis 1 and 2. By governing the earth well, I understand the passage to be suggesting that it is man's responsibility to establish God's righteous rule across the earth. God gave man everything he needed for the task: food, security, a clear guideline, and a choice teammate. Yet man disobeyed God and destroyed the unity of the team. The fall of man in Genesis 3 ushers in a reality of blame where instead of working together, mankind works against each other in a way of self promotion. Sin destroys mankind, and we actively involve ourselves in sin when we find ways of putting down each other subconsciously as a means of feeling better about ourselves. Usually that's the case. Can you think of ways in which we do this? Now, that original falling of man, I have come to describe as death to the weak for the purposes of this presentation. After the sin of Adam and Eve, the Bible tells us of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain. Notice, the one who chooses to do God's will is somehow presented as the weaker in the story and is overpowered by his brother and then who kills him. God doesn't allow Cain to get away with the murder, and he finds his punishment too much to bear. He becomes a wanderer on the earth. And so begins a pattern. Doing God's will is often looked down on by those bent on self-promotion. And once again, once we are so bent, we find it easy to castigate those who we deem weaker, especially those who attempt to obey God. Noah will find himself in the same position, bearing the ridicule of an ungodly nation. But guess whom God vindicates? And just like Cain, when we choose to go against God's will, we are left with a sense of alienation and we become much more destructive towards our brothers and our sisters. But our example continues with Abraham. Abraham and his step of faith. The first great patriarch of the Bible is Abraham, and he answered God's call to leave his idol worshipping clan to follow the God whom no one knows. His life reveals several incidences of God honoring him as the weak. Consider the following two. Abraham has a dispute with his nephew Lot. Lot chooses the better land and leaves what is left to Abraham. Abraham takes the side of the weak. But God honors Abraham instead of Lot and gives to Abraham the whole landscape, including that which was chosen by Lot. And then there's the story of Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham instructed his wife to lie about his identity because of the ungodly culture of husband slaying to get to the bride. That was so in Egypt. Why would Abraham have gone to Egypt in the very first place, knowing this about it? There was a small matter of a famine which forced him there. God protected him and rewarded him with great wealth when Abimelech tried to take his beautiful bride. Then there is this oftentimes overlooked but wonderful story in the book of Genesis about Hagar. Hagar the horrible, that's how we sometimes describe her. Well, in that Abraham account, we see God protecting this practicing the same principle with Hagar. Hagar is a slave girl who Sarah got from Egypt when God disciplined Abimelech. When Sarah could not get pregnant to produce a child for Abraham, she made Hagar sleep with him to produce a child for her, as the culture allowed at the time. But once the girl got pregnant, all hell broke loose. In 2 chapters of Genesis, Sarah mistreats Hagar badly, and she is eventually thrown out to die. Both times, however, God appears to Hagar and reassures her of his care for her. The second time, he even allows for her to be totally free from slavery. And against the culture of the day, she even became the head of a clan, a great clan that springs from her son Ishmael. We view Hagar as horrible for teasing Sarah, but God sees this outcast as his and blesses her. And then there are other accounts like this in Genesis. Take for instance, Jacob is the younger and more devious of 2 boys. Yet God honors him over his brother Esau, who does not take his godly inheritance seriously. Later, Jacob's uncle Laban mistreats him and doubles his work as an act of trickery. Jacob uses trickery himself and gets rather wealthy and is finally released from the shackles of his uncle, who gets the blessing. Jacob has one son with his favorite bride, Rachel. Eventually, that will become two sons at the birth of Benjamin. But he dotes on Joseph, his older son, which leads his 10 bigger brothers to abuse him and sell him into slavery. God blessed Joseph, however, and uses him to deliver this entire family out of difficulties that they once faced. They faced family which threatens to wipe them out, but Joseph becomes the deliverer. And before then, while in slavery, Joseph survived a series of attempts that painted him guilty when he was innocent. God is on the side of the weak. And that same pattern continues in Exodus. The Israelite midwives lie to Pharaoh when they disobey his command to slaughter the Hebrew boys when they are born. God blessed them for their faith in him by giving them families of their own. And Moses survived as a babe by the ingenuity of a mother who refused to give in to threats of the king and deceived Pharaoh's daughter into adopting him while she still had the opportunity of caring for him. God provides a home for Moses among the rulers, educates him in their ways, and uses him later despite the his murder of an Egyptian oppressor. Moses does not understand the turn his life has taken when he spends 40 years in Midian. But later, God uses his desert education to have him deliver the children of Israel from their bondage in Egypt, itself another sign of God's care for the weak. The story of the final plague that would eventually lead to the deliverance of Israel from Egypt is itself another story of God's preference for the weak over the mighty. You see, that final plague that brought the back of Egyptian resistance to God was indeed the plague of the firstborn, which struck at the very heart of the most celebrated aspect of Egyptian culture, the celebration of the mighty seen in the firstborn son. The mighty were toppled on that first Passover night, and the weak and despised Israelites were led to victory. The biblical message is clear in all these examples in the Pentateuch, and many more actually do exist. God has a special interest in caring for the despised and mistreated, and often comes to their assistance, especially when the mighty paints them into corners where their lives are at stake. And if you look at the other parts of the Hebrew Bible, you see the pattern repeated. Check out the following stories, for example. In Deuteronomy 15, it talks about the care of slaves and the poor as being of paramount importance in the life of Israel. There's this wonderful story in Judges 3 of Ehud and Eglon. Ehud's left-handedness likely means that he was a crippled in his right hand, but that was used as the means of his victory over wicked Eglon. Then there's a story of Deborah, the first female judge of Israel, who rises to the top when the more celebrated man refused to take up his place in the leadership of society. Deborah was granted a blessing. The story of Gideon and the Midianites in Judges chapter 6, and how Gideon was from the smallest clan, and he was the most insignificant, and he was a coward. Yet still God used him to defeat the Midianites. There's a story of Jephthah. Jephthah in Judges 10 to 12. Jephthah, born as an outcast, born to a prostitute mother, and imposed upon a family who then rejects him because they said, "You will not have the inheritance of our father." Yet still God uses Jephthah to deliver Israel. He gets the blessings. Then there's Samson, the strong man who is constantly defiant about Israel's laws. But God used him, a despised Samson, to become the deliverer of the people of Israel. The call of Samuel in 1 Samuel 3 tells us about God choosing a small boy to be the future leader of Israel in the light of the failure of the more celebrated priest Eli. Samuel himself comes and anoints David as king in 1 Samuel 16. David is a forgotten, the overlooked son of Jesse, who, when God sent the prophet to anoint his son to be king, Jesse paraded his first 7 sons, forgetting that he even had an 8th son, the young lad who was out tending sheep, who would become the deliverer of Israel. David and Goliath itself is a story of this God favoring the weak, because small David, with his faith in God, was more than a handful for the champion Goliath, whom he slew, killed him with a stone, then chopped off his head. And you look through the minor prophets, you will see that this justice concern of God is always a concern about what the state of the poor, state of the outcast, and what Israel ought to do in light of that. Micah 6 verse 8, a celebrated passage that we all know about, says, "He has shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord desires of thee, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." It's then not surprising that we see the message of God's preferential option for the poor and the outcast carrying over into the New Testament. Check, for instance, Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1, 46 to 55. Or Jesus' ministry declaration in Luke 4, 18 to 19, and a host of other passages of like-mindedness in Luke. Then there is the unity of the first church in Acts 2, 42 to 47, in that passage where we see where they sold everything and cared for the poor. And Acts 20, 35 talks about the blessedness of giving over receiving, caring for others. The warning to restore gently in Galatians 6. You should never consider yourself so mighty that you are going to trample on the one who has offended. And then Philippians 2 talks about the mind of Christ and the admonition that we should use that mind of Christ to care for others, not to celebrate our high and mighty self. And then there's this fantastic passage, most often overlooked, in Revelations 18 verse 9 and the end of verse 13 in particular, which talks about the sin list of those who mourn fallen Babylon. The passage ends with those who make profit from slavery. So let us now talk about, or ask the question, Jamaican liberation. Jamaica, like many other island nations in our region, was founded upon a slave society. The rights of our slaves were systematically stripped away, and a spirituality was preached to them that made it more godly to accept their lot as slaves than as free men. After emancipation, society continued to be organized along such lines, and that treated the average black man as a second-class citizen. Today, race has largely given way to class, and the poorest among us are not afforded the best amenities in life for them to live out their full potential, whether that be educationally, health-wise, housing, etc. The biblical message makes it clear that it is mandatory that God's people practice a spirituality that addresses these concerns. So let me summarize what I've been saying. It seems clear to me that the consistent message of the Bible, apart from promoting a relationship between God and man, is that it promotes a significantly important idea that man ought to be careful about how he relates to other mankind. What concerns God gravely, according to the biblical message, is the systematic dehumanization of the weak and poor, and the creation of social norms that does this, apart from praying for the change of these ideologies and practices in the world, the person who seeks to please God must oppose all systems, values, and ideas that trample on others, and must work for the establishment of a society that promotes the well being of the weakest. Our failure to do this is not in keeping with the biblical account, even if we are the greatest persons of promoting praise and worship of God. What sayest you? I have presented my thoughts, which need much more fleshing out, I agree. Please feel free to discuss and disagree with my points. I'm looking forward to some fine discussion. Just drop me a line now and let us have the discussion begin. Thanks.